Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bonsoir. Welcome to the to Nice Fictions in our presentation, our introduction to Embroidered Worlds, which probably you won't be able to see from the camera, but this is an anthology of Ukrainian science fiction and fantasy, and as far as we know, it's probably the first full-length collection in English translation, and maybe even one of the first in the world. I don't know. I think that Patrice Lejoya is working on a French language one right now that probably will be published in a few months. In any case, my name is Michael Brianek, and I have with me Emily Bell and Valia Dudic Lepescu. They'll be doing most of the talking, telling us about the book. Now, Emily has some time constraints. She's on a nebulous panel at the bottom of the hour. So, well, before I get her to tell her part, could the two of you please introduce yourselves? Emily, please.
Yes, hi. I'm Emily Bell. I write and edit under EDE Bell, also my name, just different. And our press was the one who published Embroidered Worlds. And I do apologize for the conflict. I think the chances of a 9 a.m. panel in Pasadena and a 5:30 p.m. panel in France were not on a Friday were not something that I was expecting to overlap, but here we are. So I'm really pleased to be with you today and hopefully provide some insight into this absolutely wonderful collection and how it came to be.
Valia.
Hello, I'm Valia Dudic Lepescu. I'm a Ukrainian American writer, poet, and editor living in Chicago. I'm the author of several books of fiction and nonfiction, as well as a graphic novel. I used to teach as well, and still try to do some workshops on the side. It was my honor to help shepherd this book into existence. And to work with the fantastic writers and translators and editors that we had on this team. And I'm really honored to be here to talk about it. Thank you.
Great. So, Emily, could you start us off and tell us, say, your side of the project, the publishing and the project history, and maybe something about the Kickstarter that funded all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the things we'll probably talk about a lot while I'm here is the complication and complexity of anthologies and translated anthologies and international anthologies. They're important and they're brilliant, but they're not easy or simple. And so after this wave of the invasion, there were authors of Ukrainian heritage and culture who wanted to help. And they thought, well, we have stories that we've written. Perhaps we could raise money for charity. We could collect them. We could donate them. What can we do to help? They became connected with people writing in Ukraine who said, well, we have stories as well, maybe. And they started to come up with ideas. Perhaps we could get a grant to translate them. And basically over this process, they went through different publishers, many different editors, even different grants, and learned this is a very difficult thing to do correctly. And correctly doesn't mean perfect. It means appropriately, to properly represent a culture, the stories, the translations. And we were approached in Ottawa, Canada, by one of these authors who said, this project is at risk of not happening. Is there a possibility that you could help? And initially we thought that it was much further, being honest, we thought it was much further along than it turned out to be. And it did almost fall apart many, many more times. But once we were, again, sort of the universe came in and connected with Valia, we realized, because we told them, several people asked us just to do it. And I said, no way. I am not Ukrainian. I do not understand the culture, the sensitivities. I cannot do this. I can publish it, but we need to have a Ukrainian team doing it. And once we were connected with Valia and then with the editors Olha Norinyan in Ukraine, we said, this is a team that could do this. And we met and said, this is going to be difficult. Will we do it? And we said, yes, we'll do it. We won't let it drop. We will make it happen. And we did. So it took that whole team, and then it took we could talk about this depending on what you'd like to talk about, an entire international team of people to make this book happen. It was an incredible coming together.
So, how did the Kickstarter come about? I don't know who was first responsible for it, but I think this was I think an incredible thing. From my point of view, I think it was very successful. Though I think that some people were hoping for a little bit more, but in any case, successful. What can you tell us about that?
It was absolutely successful, and both things can be true. There is a certain sometimes struggle when you see something that is so important to a whole planet or much of the planet, and you're still climbing and struggling to make it happen. It is frustrating, but it was a success and it did happen. As for the Kickstarter, I think the most important thing to talk about is how much a book like this costs. Every time I tell somebody about it, they are stunned. Even people in the publishing industry say, I hadn't thought about that. First of all, we are going to pay Ukrainian writers taking this energy out of themselves to do this. We are going to pay translators properly, if not well, at least properly. To pay them well I don't consider that we paid them well. I consider that we paid them, as properly as we could. So just for a scope of costs, we had somebody purchase the cover for us. We did not have to pay for the cover. Much time was donated. Much time. I mean, I would consider it tens of thousands of dollars if we had to pay for it at least. There were some donated stories, there were donated reviewers, sensitivity reviewers, editors, just the promotion, people doing blog posts from around the world to advertise this campaign. All of that was donated. And still, the money that we paid out that came, out of cash from our hands to other people was $35,000 United States dollars. And I don't think a lot of people understand that that's what it took to make this book that people were all donating to and wanted to make happen. So my small press is run out of this house with me and my spouse. We don't have $35,000 at all. And so we wanted to make this book happen, but we don't have that money to pay for that. And so we had two sources for the money, again, other than all the global generous donations. And one of those was the Ukrainian Book Institute in Ukraine. We, and that actually took a lot of help too, with people helping us apply. Somebody is doing very loud yard work. I apologize for that if you hear it. They're grinding trees outside my house. This is the small press life. The grant, people helped us apply for the grant on a very short timeline. It was a tremendous amount of work. We had to get contracts in place without yet knowing who would be translating what story. We had to do this in a few days. So just the fact that we were able to apply with this many stories for this grant on that timeline was already a triumph. It really, really was. And that paid for most of the translation work. But that was not the full $35,000 United States dollars. That was not that. That was a big piece of that, and it was critical. But we also had other translations to do. We had authors to pay. We had to print the books to give to the people who donated, or not donated. We had to pay the people that pledged to the Kickstarter. We had to print the books to send them, and all those things. And by the way, the $35,000 does not include the shipping. So the rest of it had to come from the Kickstarter. And Kickstarters, I think a lot of people, I've heard that a lot. People see a Kickstarter and they say, "Oh wow, you made, $5,000, you made $10,000." No, usually if you're getting $5,000 or $10,000 on a Kickstarter, you're breaking even or losing money because you're making the thing that those people are buying. They're being more generous than in a retail setting, but you still have to make it. And so the combination of that immense, tremendously successful, well supported Kickstarter and the grant from the Ukrainian Book Institute basically covered those costs for the book. We basically broke even across the board. But the Kickstarter was simply a way we had to finish making the book.
Okay, and so Vale, you got involved at what stage?
I had first been approached as one of the writers. I was invited to submit one of my stories for the anthology, and that was the first time I had heard about the anthology. And that was soon after February of 22nd. I think it was March of 22. And I did not hear anything for another year. It was quiet, and there was, I'm sure, a lot going on behind the scenes, but I was not yet involved at that time. And then I was approached a year later because they knew that I had had editorial experience, and several of the initial committee that was putting this together approached me and asked me if I would be interested in editing it. And so first I told them I wanted to hear more about the behind the scenes, and then Emily and I met. And as soon as I met Emily and we talked, I knew this book would be in very good hands. And so I felt completely comfortable putting myself into the project and working with Aya and Irina as well. So I feel like this whole project was a labor of so many different communities, international communities, publishing communities, Ukrainian communities. It was just pulling together so many circles of people. It was really a remarkable thing to be a part of.
Emily, just to get back to the Kickstarter, I assume that you were the one of the main people behind it, and I'm just
Made person.
okay. So my experience when I was watching this, I was nervous the whole time, waiting for the minimum to go by, and then the next stage, et cetera, et cetera. How did you feel about it, or the emotions going through you as this went on?
It started out with a lot of excitement because I saw a big wave at first, and just seeing some of the people that were writing promotions for the campaign, Sonia Suleiman and Wole Talabi, and we had people that Brian Tawar were coming in saying, please support this. And then it very quickly turned into a lot of stress and worry. I mean, it was well worth it, and I understood what we were doing this for, so I wasn't bothered by it. But it would not be truthful to say that it wasn't a tremendous amount of strain and stress and frustration as well. To say, you know, that's a longer conversation than we have about this book, but the culture around supporting stories, supporting translating them, supporting how much they actually cost to do. And I guess I would also emphasize that it's not just taking a story that's written and say, well, it's already written. You just take it and you put it in a book. No, you don't. Translating, and this could be another topic on, humans versus robots. And I love robots, but I don't want them translating these stories, please. And the nuance in understanding culture in a translation is so critical. So to have people, not just humans, but humans familiar with Ukrainian language and culture, that is a lot of work and effort and nuance, and also sensitivity reading. Things may land different in global audiences. And so it's very important. There could be one, this is true with a lot of things, including running conventions and panels, which I also do. When you're editing, there have been lots of examples of a book or a story that get the whole focus goes to one thing that was done, one thing that caused offense or hurt in the book. And so going through with caution and care and making sure, just even, inadvertently, there aren't mistranslations or phrases or things that just culturally would, draw offense globally. Not that they're not speaking plainly, but just unintentional cultural offense, things like that takes a lot of effort. So you can't just take the stories, put them in the book, and publish it. You really have to be cognizant. And also, in terms of this is something I'd encourage you to talk to Valia about, when I have to run the other way to California, not just I'll still be here, is just when you curate a collection, it's also important to represent, somewhat broadly the culture. Now, it's important to say this collection came from, it was not an open submission process. It came from a specific sort of winding, bizarre road. So it wasn't the same as if we had really started this fresh. We would have looked more broadly at people, but we had a good collection already, and we had a time urgency to it. So then it gets into looking at, are there people from particular cultures, from particular faiths? Are there other cultures that could be included that would provide a broader picture of, of what we're trying to share with the world? I guess what I'm saying is, and I know this was about the Kickstarter, but I think this is relevant to the whole stress and strain and why it was worth it, is you need to fund doing it properly enough that if you're going to take the responsibility of introducing cultural storytelling to a more global audience, you really need to do it properly and with caution and care and love and a desire to share it without harm. So yeah, I was worried, but yeah, it was a lot of stress. I won't pretend otherwise, but look, in the face of what we're dealing with, um, of course we were going to do it. That's Valia says that she connected with me. Well, I connected with Valia because I could tell that we both understood that. We're like, this is going to be a lot. This is going to be a lot that we might even not even have the energy to do, but we got put in a place we can do it, and we're going to do it.
So, again, just staying with the Kickstarter for a few more minutes. How much, what was the diversity of support for it? Do you have some idea of what people from where they came from who were supporting it? Was it
Yes, I didn't
mainly?
run I don't have the exact numbers here, but it was all over the world. The the posts were from all over the world, the backers were from all over the world. My spouse trying to figure out how to ship these packages. We're used to we are, even as tiny as we are, we consider ourselves an international press. We love that. We feel very proud of that. And we're used to shipping packages globally, but we ran into new and interesting situations with this that we actually recently got one back from Singapore because it was missing a couple characters, and that was an expensive package, but it has been turned around and is now the Embroidered Worlds has now arrived in Singapore, so that's official now. So yeah, we're still shipping as of now, but now they're all there, and getting the books to Ukraine was a challenge. Uh, we are pretty sure they were read in customs or some such thing. So, and uh, yeah, it was all over the world. And you can even see. I actually encourage people, if you the Kickstarter is worth reading on its own just because of the really fascinating updates from people in Ukraine and of Ukrainian heritage and Ukrainian culture, but also from those not from around the world that say this is why this is important to us as a non-American, non-Canadian, non-Ukrainian. I'm from somewhere else, and this is important to me, and here's why. So the updates on that were really, to me, very interesting on their own.
Okay. So Emily, in the last few minutes before you have to leave, what what more would you like to say? Would you what more would you like other people, the audience, to know about it, about your efforts? The I forgot to mention the name of your publishing house, Athos Arts.
Yep,
Um,
Athosards. Well, what I would like people to know is there's a little cause that I've been taking on, and I call it Support Bold Indies. I made it up, but I'm a writer. I get to write things. And it is not to take away from big publishing or other types of publishing. It doesn't take away. but small, bold, independent presses are extraordinarily critical in this world. And I kind of went through that on my social media, what that means. Um, this it's not just small presses because it doesn't really matter if you're small. It matters if you're bold and independent. Independent is important because there are things that independent presses can do and say and take on that, even just financially. Yes, a corporation could have afforded this book, but they wouldn't have done it because they could have done it and they didn't do it. So even, I don't even mean, just, in terms of free speech and political, I mean, you have to have people that are independent enough to say, this is not about money and we're going to do it and we're going to make it work. And you need people that are bold enough to do that because just being independent, there are lots of wonderful, wonderful independent publishers that are publishing, very mainstream romance and adventure and things like that. And those are great. But what is hard to get funded is things that are different, things that are independent and different and that take risks and that are bold, whether that is new types of fiction, well, they're not new voices, but voices that the big publishers aren't familiar with. Big publishers will read a book written in another continent from them and say, I don't think this is very popular. I'm not familiar with this storytelling. And it's like, right, but you still have to, but please support it, and they won't. And so what I'm trying to say is, please seek out bold and independent storytellers. There's lots of them out there, and support them. And I believe that is true in fiction, in activism, and in journalism. Nonfiction journalism is in a lot of the same situation. Like Tutomo, for example, like support people that are doing independent work because you have to actively support it. Because this book took hundreds of people, if not more. Uh, well, it did take more because there was more than that in backers. It took thousands, I'll say it that way. This book took thousands of people to make. So you have to put the effort in, but look how worth it is. Just look how worth it is. And please be proactive and seek out those voices and support them because I promise the people who hold the power are actively trying to do the opposite. And it's really hard to do this kind of work right now, work that is risky and that is hard and that is important. The last thing I'll say is in terms of what I said earlier about risk taking in the industry, I'll be interested to, well, I'll have to hear it later, but what Valia says later about, the reactions she's had, the biggest reaction I get to the book when people read it, people locally, I should say where I am. I'm here in Ferndale, Michigan, right on the border of Detroit, Michigan. And we had our book club read it. They decided to, the Ferndale Sci-Fi Book Club met in their little room and read Embroidered Worlds. And I went to their meeting and they all said things like, I've never read anything like this before. It was different than anything I'd read. I read a lot of science fiction, but the way the stories were told felt different to me. Some of it was really unexpected. And they had to kind of wrestle with, did that make it not good? And then they're like, no, it's very good. I'm just not used to it. And I'm like, right, it's Ukrainian. That's what we were trying to show you. There are cultures out there that are different, that have voices that you're not hearing. And so that was a thrill to me to hear people say, this was very different, but I really liked it. And now those people go forward with a sense of, okay, Ukrainian culture and storytelling is different. It's different than me. It's an an idea of all the cultures that this planet has and how beautiful they really, are. So yeah, are there any other quick questions before I have a few more minutes, but then I'll have to.
Um, you sort of alluded to this, but um, do you think that Embroidered Worlds has perhaps, actually considering what happened a year ago, I'm not sure that's the right way to put it, but broke the dam in terms of more of these other publishers might get interested in doing things like this?
I wouldn't put it so strongly, and I don't even mean the phrasing. I just mean I think we all have to. I think the more of us contribute to making these efforts, the more it will encourage other people to do so. So I think this was one more push in a world of other people that are trying to, and it's not just English language, obviously, people that are putting story, and it's not just Ukrainian stories even, people that are taking important stories and sharing them in to other parts of the world. We are all showing what power it holds. And the more people do it, the more people push for it, the more people, I mean, I've heard that the Ukrainian Book Institute grants, and I'm sure this is true in every country, have to be fought for pretty fiercely for the funding. So the more people do it, the more people speak about it, the more people share these types of works, it will continue to normalize the idea of global storytelling, despite the tax difficulties, despite the shipping difficulties, despite the cultural difficulties, the risk taking, the financial difficulties. We have it gets easier when we normalize it, so we need to keep normalizing it.
Okay. You have to go. You have to go.
Yes, and I'm sorry about that, but but Valia is wonderful to listen to anyway. So I'm leaving you in some very lovely hands, and I don't feel too bad about that. So about that part. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this and for hosting this, and for Valia for joining me. And I will just now hop over to 9 a.m. in the morning somewhere else. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily.
Take care.
Take care. Bye. Okay, Valia. So you were the what was exactly you? So you were it seems to me you were the main editor in this project. So what was your okay, you mentioned that you were originally just one of the authors in the original plans. So how did you become the editor?
One of that original group of people who were putting this together, we connected at a conference in Florida, and excuse me, and I asked her how the status of things was going, and she said, "Oh my goodness, this is much more complex than we had anticipated, and there are so many different things we don't really know and aren't sure how to move forward." And so we had a conversation, and she invited me on as editor. And from that point on, boy, there were many hats, but most of it was doing my best to first review the stories that had been already collected. And that was with the help of Irina and Alya. They had already, before I was brought on, they had gotten in touch with the genre community in Dnipro where they live and nearby, and others that they had connected to because of the Ukrainian speculative fiction scene. There are and have been, prior to recent aggression, there were different conferences and things where they would network, and online places. And so they had a network of writers, and they solicited stories from the people that they knew, and reviewed them and then discussed them. And so I had a list of stories to consider when I came on, and went through those. Thankfully, I can read Ukrainian. There were a few that had been submitted in Russian language, and most of those were not being considered because they wanted to keep it to Ukrainian writers in Ukraine or in the diaspora who are writing in Ukrainian, and as well as diaspora writers who are writing in English. After looking at the list of writers that was there, I saw that there were some gaps. As Emily had mentioned, we really want, Ukraine is such a large country, and most of these stories, because of constraints and because of where the connections were, and there's a war going on, were coming from largely Eastern Ukraine, close to the fighting, which has its own identity and power there. But we also, as this became something larger and we were able to include more stories, we wanted to try and reach out within a very short amount of time to other writers that we could, to try to broaden what that experience would be like of Ukrainian writers writing speculative fiction. And so through networks of mine and others that were involved, we reached out a little bit, and we were able to get some stories, tried to review those, and look at also the types of genres. We wanted to get a variety of not just science fiction, but also fantasy, also weird fiction. There's some alternative history. Like, we wanted to really horror. We wanted to broaden the experience of speculative, because it wasn't just science fiction. It wasn't just fantasy. We wanted to include all of as much of the speculative fiction flavor as we could give. And then there was the question of, okay, do we keep diaspora writers, or do we limit it to writers from Ukraine, in Ukraine, or displaced recently from Ukraine? And went back and forth on that as well. But after talking with Aya and Irina, because we consulted with them at every stage and asked them, well, what do you think would be most valuable? This is this first anthology that's coming out in English of Ukrainian voices. And they said that they would like, because we are part of the conversation, we are part of the continuum, they would like to include the diaspora writers as well. And so we moved forward with that, invited a few more of the writers. Most of those were already secured. There is not a large number of us that are connected as far as writers of Ukrainian heritage writing speculative fiction. I tried to reach out to a few in Australia, some in Argentina. I wasn't able to get in touch with everyone that I tried to reach out to, but did the best I could in a short amount of time to also, as broadly as possible, contact Ukrainian writers, in Ukrainian diaspora writers, and started to put together that collection. At that point, we heard about the Book Institute grant, and everything just intensified, because there was within a week of a deadline where we had to collect all of this and make some really quick decisions about working with the translators and signing, committing to what that table of contents would look like. And so we moved from that point on. It was just a mad dash to the end, because that created an absolute deadline by which we had to get certain things in. And even then with the Kickstarter, to finish rounding off the costs, the Institute required that the book be published by the end of the year. And so we had, again, a very short amount of time to make that happen. So the Kickstarter had to occur right away, and we had to hit the ground running as soon as we were funded to get everything translated as well.
So I think that it's fair to say that there are, these days there are a lot of Ukrainian writers who are writing science fiction, fantasy, and so on. And so you probably had the bulk of the stories already chosen, so there wasn't necessarily a good chance for you to really reach out for a lot more.
Correct.
And that it just, to me, that just what Embroidered Worlds is just a small window into Ukrainian literature of the imagination. So with that comment, maybe we can ask something else now about what I think is really fascinating is the translation process. And I think that it's not that easy, I think, to find certified translators from Ukrainian into English. I think it's even worse in other languages like French, though things are starting to improve there, from what I know. But what was the experience in finding translators?
It's also a little bit frantic, because we had that tight deadline. So that was something, the translators had not yet, there had not been any translators brought onto the project when I came on. So that we were starting from zero for the translators. We were lucky enough that a few of the diaspora writers had experience translating, so we were able to ask them to translate a story or two, but it's a large anthology and we needed much more in the time that we had. And so, again, began with my network, as well as from anthologies that have been published that I have purchased of Ukrainian literature translated into English that was not speculative. And so reaching out, a lot of those translators that are working in the field right now were busy because they had seen an increase in interest for things to be translated into English from Ukrainian, not just fiction, but nonfiction. People were really overcommitted. And so I asked them in turn for their recommendations. And so within their communities, they had colleagues who were perhaps some less known or just starting out. So we have really a range. We have very seasoned translators, and then we have some that are really at the beginning of their translating career, and reached out, explained the project. Not everyone had translated speculative fiction before. That was another challenge. Most people that I was able to get in touch with had done sort of conventional literary or mainstream fiction, but not speculative. And so we had to talk a little bit about what are the challenges with that, and do you feel comfortable with doing that? Most of them were absolutely up for the challenge and enjoyed the experience and had a lot to say about it on the other end after having translated the stories. But it was really important to find people who understood what the project was about and what the stories were going to be like, and that they were going to be different stories than they maybe had experienced before in translation. And so it was a learning process for all of us, I think.
Emily mentioned sensitivity readers. And was there anything that you found that was, I mean, we're talking about Ukrainian culture as opposed to, if I can call it Western culture, North American culture at any rate. What were there any sort of interesting things that came out of that? That there was some difference of viewpoint that didn't quite match? No, not really.
Yeah, there were, I think this, and this would have been a great question to ask Emily, because she has the sensitivity reading is something that she does with, I think, all of her books that the press puts out. And so it would be interesting to know how that differed from other either translations or anthologies that she's done. I think because of the nature of when a lot of these stories are being written, there is, even though they are speculative, there is a lot of, or there's a fair amount of death or reference to war or violence, because I think that speculative fiction is also a window and a mirror. And so writers are writing about what they are experiencing, even if it is being transformed into a, into a speculative story. And so those are sort of more time and space specific than culturally specific. Sometimes it was just a matter of the words that were being chosen. Like, I can't remember if this was in a story or in a conversation we had about translation. Excuse me. But there are things like, there are idioms that we will say in Ukrainian that don't translate well if you translate them directly. And so there's the question of, do you translate the idiom to keep that, or do you try to use an English language idiom to convey the idea, that type of thing. And sometimes they sound kind of absurd, and it's like you don't want to introduce humor or in a moment where maybe that wasn't the intention, because the translation doesn't convey the author's intent. So we had conversations with the translators when something like that would happen. And then sometimes we would ask the writers, the authors themselves, and give them two options and say, which do you feel is most true to what you're trying to get across? And so we really tried to stay as true to the story as possible, always, and to try to give the reader the experience of how this is a Ukrainian story. Because as Emily mentioned, my experience has also been with people who have read the Ukrainian translated stories for the first time, is that it's a different type of storytelling. And that's what I wanted with the translations. I didn't want them to become pressed into like an English language genre mold. I wanted to try to preserve, if they were doing interesting things with time and structure that maybe are different from our conventions in America, for example. And so I read a lot of, and I've tried to keep up with a lot of global speculative fiction anthologies. So I referred to a lot of them to see, what can I tell about like the Chinese language stories translated, like how are they different, or the ones that are coming out of African speculative literature, and trying to see, okay, I see how this is showing me something about the culture. And I wanted that to happen with this anthology as well. And so there were a few times where people would read this like, oh, that's really different. I haven't seen characters developed in that way, or I haven't seen people move back and forth with time in that way, or the sentence structure is even a little bit different. And I'm happy when they notice that, because yes, that shows us, that gives them a little bit of a taste of how things are different. If you were to hear it or read it in Ukrainian, it's a different experience. So of course it can never be the same, but I wanted to try to incorporate more of that than less of that.
One of the things that I noticed, that I observed, was that I think most, if not all, of the writers were, I think, relatively young writers. And of course, there are an older generation of Ukrainian speculative fiction writers. So was that by design, or did it just shake out that way?
No, I think that is largely the community that Aya and Irena were a part of, and that they drew from. They really looked to the voices that are on the Ukrainian websites where most people are reading these stories. They looked to those communities and to those, it would be as if now if you looked at the like Uncanny, or the stories that are being published, say in Uncanny, for example, and you looked at the writers there are a lot of really young writers. There are, of course, always older writers as well, but they try to feature and bring to the forefront new people, new voices. And I think there was something very similar with that initial pool of writers that were picked. Again, if there was more time, like if there had been a year and we did a call, and I would have looked at that differently to try to also be as inclusive as possible, because I think there is a difference in the voices of the writers writing in their 20s and 30s today, and the writers who have the history, like we have the experience of, the Cold War and the Soviet Union in a very different way, and that shapes the stories as well. And so we don't get a lot of that, I think, and that is another gap. Hopefully there will be more books to follow that can really bring that to the forefront, because there are a lot of voices that still need to be shared and amplified as well.
So I'm not going to ask you whether you're going to start on a new collection in the next little while, but if you did, or if somebody else did, what would you like to see? What sort of things, as you were just talking about, what sort of things would you think are important for follow-ups?
Oh, I think much of what we've been talking about in terms of the diversity of voices, to get a wider range of the country itself. It's interesting when we think about the title of Embroidered Worlds, even, and embroidery is such an important part of Ukrainian culture. And I love that there are these maps that show you from east to west the different types of embroidery as they vary by region. You know, they're so rich in different types of patterns and colors and recognizable depending on where they are. And it's the same way with borscht, you know, our one of our national soup, and how everyone has a different borscht recipe depending on where you come from. The stories are the same. They're so different. The experiences that they have had, whether someone grew up in Krim or Lviv or Kharkiv, Odessa, like you get such a different flavor for what that experience was like. And so I would like to see truly a broader view of the writers across the country, as well as a greater diversity of even the ages, because I think that would be really valuable. And I think a historical anthology, I personally would love to see, of the earliest Ukrainian writers who never get translated or rarely get translated into English and have never been appreciated by English reading audiences. And I don't even know all of them because growing up, I didn't have access to those stories. And I wish that I had. I have not read the classics, because as a young person in America, in Chicago in the 70s and 80s, that I didn't have access to those. So yeah, a historical one would be wonderful as well for context.
Indeed, I think, you know, in a perfect world, there would have been a 3-volume anthology, historical, say, Soviet times, and then newer writers.
Yes.
But, well, you get what you.
There's so much room on the shelf for those books as well.
Yes. Yes. So recently, was it just yesterday? I think there was an article written by Kate Serkin from Kiev Independent, where she listed several Ukrainian writers and their works who have been translated into English, and it was very good. But one thing that I mentioned was that there was no speculative fiction in that list. And I don't know what exactly that is due to, but what is your, what do you think within Ukraine, from what you can tell, from your experience, what is the reception of science fiction, fantasy, horror within the population as a whole? Did you get a sense of that? I mean, we know that in science fiction fantasy is not necessarily considered to be particularly highbrow, or didn't used to be. That's changing a little bit in the West. But what is your sense about what is happening in Ukraine?
Oh, this is where I wish Alia was here. She could speak to this with a much greater authority. You know, I'm in Chicago, and so I am really removed from what that exact experience is like. I find it interesting when we think about the language that's even been used in the war and the metaphors that get used. There's a lot of fantasy allusions, but they're typically fantasy allusions to Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or Star Wars. You know, we're very much Western driven because that's kind of the mass media metaphor that we hear. And those are, you know, predominant. I mean, those are prominent in Ukraine as well as have made their way over here to the rest of the world as well. When they talk about just that, you know, the fight, the struggle of, you know, good versus evil as it breaks down into a binary sometimes. I don't feel like I can speak with any great authority to the literary scene there, although I would like to know the answer to that question as well. I know that I have a feeling just from my conversations with Alia that it is similar, I think, to the way that it is, at least in the United States, where I don't think that genre is yet at the same level as mainstream or literary. But I don't have numbers, and I don't know how that breaks up even within the genres. Like, is there more fantasy being read and written than science fiction or horror? I don't know. I don't know.
I did an interview with 5 young writers, Ukrainian writers, women writers, and I think a couple of them did mention that speculative fiction in Ukraine is considered to be non-serious literature, which sort of surprises me because from what I've seen, that type of literature in that part of the world is very, very often much more serious than the similar literature in from the West. In any case, that's something to we all need to find out more about. Perhaps
I
another.
I
Yep.
wonder if there's a reclaiming to be had or in process, because I think in terms of like the idea of lowbrow versus highbrow, there's largely like colonial mentality in the sense of things that were Ukrainian folk art or folk language or literature or folklore were so often pushed down as lesser culture in the broader Russian propaganda, right? And I think that there is there's a reclaiming of a lot of that we're seeing and have been seeing, and a revisioning of what that looks like moving forward into the future. And I think perhaps it's similar to this idea, well, those are like children's fairy tale kinds of stories as opposed to serious literature, when it was talked down about. And I think that's like reclaiming that and amplifying those voices. And I think that is really something powerful that we will continue to see. And I think that's something that the young people that we have in the anthology are really they're struggling with a lot of, they're bringing some of that, but they're still very forward thinking, future forward writers in a lot of what they're writing. So it reflects that, but it's turning into something new and different.
There's something else that I would like to get your idea on. And so Embroidered Worlds, of course, is literature of the imagination, which I think I like a lot better translated from the French as opposed to speculative fiction. But there are other types of genre fiction in the world, of course. And there is a couple of very decent translations of Ukrainian historical detective fiction, both set in Lviv before the Second World War and during Polish times, and then again just before the Soviet takeover. And I don't know if you are interested in that detective fiction at all, but what would you say what would you think about similar efforts in that field as a parallel to Embroidered Worlds?
Oh, I would love to see that. I am less familiar. I'm not someone who's an avid detective story reader, but I think it would be fascinating to see how that story plays out differently in a Ukrainian context. And I think that would absolutely be a valuable contribution as well. I think of the old pulps, right? Like in the old American pulps, and that would have been one of those places where like the detective story would have been published in pulp magazines and in the US, as well as like the weird tales and other things. So I understand that they've kind of grown up in a similar soil. And so it would be really interesting to see that translation as well.
What's really, really interesting is one of the novels that I'm talking about was written by Yuri Vinachuk, who wrote basically the title story for Embroidered Worlds. So I don't know. I like to think that we can argue about what genre is and how it fits into literature as a whole, but there are links from one to the other.
Oh, absolutely. We have a detective story in our anthology as well. So there's overlap, right?
Yes.
There's overlap.
We have about 5 minutes left. And what final words would you like to say about Embroidered Worlds? And perhaps more about the future of such things?
Boy, what would I say? I am just so grateful to have had a part in bringing this into the world. There's a quote that I like that I used in my Kickstarter article, and it's in his translator's postscript to the novel The Three-Body Problem by Lu Shen. Ken Liu writes about the challenges of translation. And if I could, it's a short little quote. He says, "The best translations into English do not, in fact, read as if they were originally written in English. The English words are arranged in such a way that the reader sees a glimpse of another culture's patterns of thinking, hears an echo of another's language's rhythms and cadences, and feels a tremor of another people's gestures and movement." And I love that. That was sort of one of those guiding principles for me when I was working on this. And I think that's so true about translated stories from all around the world. And so I think there is so much to be experienced and learned from both from imagination and joy, but also empathy when it comes to those stories and reading those stories, not just for Ukrainian literature, but for international literature. And so I hope that independent presses and small presses and even big publishing houses take on more of these projects to be able to bring more of those voices out into the world. And I would like to be a part of that in whatever way I am able. At this time, I am not working on another editorial project. I'm not working on another anthology. I'm working on the second volume of my graphic novel. So that's consuming my time at the moment. But I hope to continue doing whatever I can to help bring those into the world.
My goodness, that comes up, that brings up Ukrainian graphic literature comics as well, which is a whole different topic, a whole fascinating topic.
Yes.
That's a field that is growing, I think, very, very quickly in the last few years.
Agreed. That's also very exciting.
Well, we have 2 minutes left. Yes. Any last words? I'm sorry, giving it to you.
No, that's okay. I am just grateful for the opportunity to share these stories. And I'm so grateful that you were such a large supporter and continue to be such a large supporter, not just of this book, but of Ukrainian language stories in general. You were one of the first people that I read writing about it in Locus when you were writing articles. And that was such a joy for me because, as I said before, when I was young and in my 20s and 30s, looking for anyone writing about anything Ukrainian whatsoever in English, it was incredibly difficult, especially in the field of fantastic or speculative literature. And so the fact that we are now part of the conversation, the fact that we are now part of the global like we are now recognized in the global continuum of these types of stories and what we are able to contribute. That's wonderful, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future. Ukraine is fighting for its survival, and so these stories are more important than ever, to make sure that they are not lost and these voices are cherished and learned from and experienced and shared. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think that's probably it. Okay, so thanks again, and thanks to Emily. And I hope we're going to hear more from all of you in the near future, or in the future anyway.